What happens when an innocent black teenager is wrongfully arrested and the system turns a blind eye? What if his only chance at justice lies in his mother, the U.S. Attorney General? How will the court respond when power faces power? Find out in this gripping story. Welcome to H2 Black Thread. If you believe in stories that demand to be heard, don't forget to like and subscribe. The sun hung heavy in the late afternoon sky over Silver Lake, draping the quiet suburban streets in a warm, golden glow. It was one of those California summer days where the heat pressed down like an invisible weight, making the pavement shimmer and the air thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and hot asphalt. Marcus Carter, 16 years old, wiped a bead of sweat off his forehead as he walked toward Tony's Quick Mart, the tiny, family-owned convenience store that sat on the corner of a strip mall, nestled between a laundromat and an old barber shop. He wasn't planning on being gone for long. His mom, Vanessa Carter, had called him earlier that day, reminding him, nagging him, to drink enough water in this heat. She did that a lot, always checking in, always watching out for him. She wasn't just his mom, she was Vanessa Carter, the U.S. Attorney General, one of the most powerful legal figures in the country. But to him, she was still just his mom, a woman who worried too much and texted him at least 3 times a day. He had ignored her first 2 texts, but the third one had been all caps, which meant she was serious. Marcus, hydrate. Now. He sighed, grabbed his wallet, and headed toward Tony's. The walk was barely 5 minutes, but Marcus knew better than to relax. Being a black teenager in a mostly white neighborhood meant always being aware, always following the rules that weren't written anywhere but might as well have been carved into stone. Don't run. Running made people nervous. Nervous people called the cops. Don't linger. Too much time in one place and suddenly you were loitering. Keep your hands visible. No digging in pockets, no sudden movements. Be extra polite. Even when people weren't polite to you. Never, ever argue with a cop, even if they're wrong, especially if they're wrong. It didn't matter that Marcus had lived in Silver Lake his whole life. It didn't matter that he got good grades, that he played varsity basketball, that his mother was one of the most powerful women in the country. People saw his skin before they saw him. And that was why, when Marcus pushed open the door to Tony's Quick Mart, he immediately took in his surroundings. The store was cool and quiet, the air conditioning washing over him in a welcome blast. Behind the counter, Mr. Tony, the owner, sat with a newspaper, flipping through the pages lazily. A middle-aged white guy in a polo shirt stood near the refrigerators, scanning the rows of energy drinks. Everything seemed normal. Marcus walked straight to the back, grabbed a bottle of cold water and started toward the register. And that's when he noticed it, the guy in the hoodie. He was hunched over in the snack aisle, moving too fast, his hands darting to the shelves. At first, Marcus thought the guy was just grabbing a handful of candy bars, until he noticed him shoving them deep into his pockets. Marcus froze. Oh, damn, he's stealing. It happened in a matter of seconds. The guy in the hoodie glanced up, eyes sharp with tension, and then he ran. The chime of the store's door barely had time to finish ringing before the alarm blared, loud and shrill. And suddenly, everything exploded into chaos. Mr. Tony jerked up from his newspaper. The guy in the polo turned sharply, scanning for the culprit. Marcus stood, gripping his bottle of water, frozen in disbelief. And then everything turned on him. A strong hand grabbed his arm. Marcus stumbled, heart hammering. He twisted, his breath caught in his throat. The man in front of him was tall, broad-shouldered, sunburnt skin, a 5 o'clock shadow creeping across his jawline. But it wasn't just any man. Detective Jake Monroe. You, don't move. Marcus barely had time to react before he felt himself being yanked around, his arms twisted behind his back. Wait, what the hell? That wasn't me. Click. The cold steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. Stay still. Are you serious? The guy ran that way. I was just... You fit the description. Marcus went still. That phrase. That damn phrase. He had heard it too many times. Not just in the news. Not just in viral videos. In real life. His cousin had been stopped for fitting the description. His best friend had been pulled over for no reason other than his skin color. Marcus turned desperately toward Mr. Tony. Tell him, you saw me, I just walked in here. Mr. Tony hesitated, and right there in that single half-second pause Marcus knew, he knew Mr. Tony wouldn't help him. I don't know, kid, I didn't see everything. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Are you serious? I've been coming here for years. But it didn't matter. The white guy in the polo, who had barely glanced at Marcus before, now stood watching intently, his expression unreadable. Other customers had stopped moving, their faces tense, their phones in their hands. Some whispered, some recorded, but no one stepped in. Let's go, Monroe muttered, shoving Marcus toward the door. You got the wrong person, Marcus struggled, pulse hammering. Tell it to the judge. The next few moments blurred together. Flashing red and blue lights filled the parking lot. A patrol car pulled up. Uniformed officers stepped out. Monroe handed Marcus off like he was a piece of evidence. Caught him trying to run. Marcus felt like the air had been knocked out of him. What? I never. The car door slammed shut. He sat stiff in the back seat, the plastic surface cold against his skin. His wrists burned from the tight handcuffs. Through the dirty police car window, he saw the customers outside, watching, whispering, moving on, like Marcus Carter didn't exist. And that was when the fear truly set in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was happening, and nobody cared. The ride to Silver Lake Police Station felt longer than it should have. Marcus sat stiff in the back seat, his wrists burning from the handcuffs, his breathing shallow. The plastic bench beneath him was cold and uncomfortable, but that was the least of his concerns. He had stopped struggling. Not because he wanted to, but because he knew there was no point. The two officers in the front seat barely acknowledged his existence. Detective Monroe, the one who had grabbed him in the store, sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through his phone like this was just another ordinary night. Got him in custody, shoplifting and resisting. The words cut through the tense silence as Monroe spoke into his radio. Bringing him in now. Marcus clenched his jaw, his heart pounding. Resisting? I didn't resist. I was confused. I was scared. But none of that mattered. The police station loomed ahead, a gray, windowless building sitting under the dim glow of flickering streetlights. As the car pulled into the lot, Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He had never been arrested before, never even had a real conversation with a cop. Now, he was the suspect. The moment they pulled him out of the car, Marcus felt like he was being swallowed whole by the system. Inside, the air smelled like stale coffee and old sweat, the walls lined with desks covered in paperwork, ringing phones, and tired-looking officers. Marcus barely had time to take in his surroundings before a uniformed officer grabbed his arm and steered him forward. Let's get this over with. I didn't do anything, Marcus muttered. The officer didn't respond. He was led past rows of desks, past cops who didn't even glance up at him, like he was invisible, like he was just another case. At the booking desk, a broad-shouldered officer in his late 40s, badge reading Sergeant Logan Mitchell, stood reviewing some paperwork. He had graying hair, a permanent scowl, and the tired expression of a man who had seen too much but cared too little. Detective Monroe approached him with a nod. Shoplifting, caught him at the scene. Sergeant Mitchell didn't even look at Marcus. Owner confirm it, Monroe shrugged. Didn't get a chance to check the cameras yet, but the kid fit the description. Ran when I grabbed him. Marcus felt his chest tighten. That's not true. I didn't run. I was just… Mitchell sighed loudly, rubbing his temples like he'd already heard enough. Okay, let's process him. Just like that. No camera footage. No evidence. No witnesses stepping forward. Just one cop's word against a black kid's life. The next few minutes passed in a blur of cold metal, flashing lights, and ink-stained fingers. First, mugshots. Marcus stood in front of a white backdrop, his arms still cuffed as a camera flashed in his face. One from the front. One from the side. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. Next, fingerprinting. His hands were forced onto an ink pad, then pressed onto a sheet of paper like a stamp of guilt. They already think I'm a criminal. Then came the paperwork, charges listed in bold black ink: shoplifting, resisting arrest. Marcus swallowed hard, his hands trembling. 2 lies, 2 charges, just like that. The final step was the holding area. The handcuffs were removed, replaced with zip ties, and he was led into a cold, dimly lit room with a metal bench against the wall. There were other kids there, all slumped against the walls, some staring at the ground, some looking like they'd already given up. Marcus took a deep breath, sitting down, feeling the weight of everything crashing onto his chest. This is real. This is happening. He wasn't sure how much time had passed when the door creaked open. A man in his early 30s walked in, wearing a wrinkled suit, his tie loosened like he had already given up on professionalism. He held a thin folder, barely looking up as he spoke. "Marcus Carter." Marcus sat up, his throat dry. "Yeah," the man sighed, flipping through a few pages of notes before finally looking up at him. "I'm Ethan Barnes, public defender. I'll be representing you in court tomorrow morning." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Tomorrow morning? What, so I have to stay here overnight?" Barnes barely reacted. "That's how it works, kid." Marcus gripped his knees, trying to stay calm. "I didn't do anything. They didn't even check the cameras. The guy ran. I was just buying a bottle of water." Barnes let out a tired sigh, tapping his pen against the folder. "That's what they all say, kid." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He doesn't care. None of them do. He thought about his mom, about her calling him earlier. Would she call his phone and wonder why it went straight to voicemail? Would she think he was just hanging out with friends? Would she even know where he was? She has no idea. His hands clenched into fists. This isn't fair. This isn't right, but it didn't matter. Because to everyone in this room, he wasn't a person. He was just a case file, just another black kid in the system. Hours passed. The air in the holding room felt thick, suffocating. Marcus couldn't sleep. The plastic bench was hard, the room too cold. Every time he closed his eyes, the scene at the store played over and over in his head, the alarm blaring, the handcuffs snapping around his wrists, the way no one stood up for him. If I was white, would this have happened? He already knew the answer. A guard finally came to the door, looking bored. "Carter, court hearings at 8 a.m. Get some rest." Rest. Right. Marcus stared at the ceiling. No one is going to listen. No one cares. And as the minutes dragged by, the fear sank deeper and deeper into his bones. Because tomorrow wasn't just a court date. Tomorrow, they could take his future away. And who was going to stop them? The sound of metal scraping against metal jolted Marcus awake. For a second, he was disoriented, his body stiff from spending the night curled up on the hard plastic bench in the holding area. The cold air of the station clung to his skin, mixing with exhaustion, frustration, and the dull ache of his wrists from the zip ties that had replaced the handcuffs. Then reality came rushing back. "I'm in jail." The door creaked open and a uniformed officer stepped inside, clipboard in hand. "Carter, let's go. Court hearing is in 30 minutes." Marcus sat up, his heart hammering. It was happening. His hands were tied again, zip ties biting into his skin as he was led through a series of corridors. Every step echoed, the sound bouncing off the walls, making it feel like he was walking straight into his own downfall. His lawyer, Ethan Barnes, shuffled alongside him, flipping through notes like he was studying for a test he forgot about until the last minute. "So here's the deal," Barnes muttered. "Judge Calloway is tough, no-nonsense type, doesn't like delays. Best we can do is argue for you to be released under parental supervision." "That's it?" Marcus asked, his voice rough from lack of sleep. Barnes barely spared him a glance. "That's the best you can hope for in a case like this." Marcus's stomach twisted. A case like this, like it was already decided, like his innocence was irrelevant. His mouth went dry as they approached the courtroom doors. He could hear the murmur of voices inside, the shuffle of papers, the clearing of throats. Then, the doors swung open. The moment Marcus stepped inside, he felt the weight of the room pressing down on him. It was smaller than the courtrooms on TV, but just as intimidating. Rows of wooden benches, half filled with bored spectators who didn't care about him or his fate. But the thing that dominated the room was the judge's bench, looming high like a throne of judgment, and sitting on it, Judge Richard Calloway. White, late 60s. Deep lines creased into his pale, stern face. His expression was cold, impassive, like he had already made his decision. "State your case," Calloway said, his tone flat, already impatient. The prosecutor, Kevin Doyle, stood up, young, eager, and ready to impress. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught at the scene of a shoplifting incident. The store owner activated the alarm and the arresting officer, Detective Jake Monroe, witnessed him attempting to flee." Marcus's head snapped up. "That's a lie, I didn't." Barnes grabbed his arm, whispering through clenched teeth. "Don't talk unless I tell you to." Marcus gritted his teeth. How could he just sit here and let them lie? Calloway barely acknowledged Marcus's outburst. "Does the prosecution have video evidence?" For a moment, Doyle hesitated. "There is surveillance footage, but it has not been reviewed yet." Marcus felt his breath hitch. "What?" Calloway nodded slowly, then waved a hand. "Then we'll proceed without it." Marcus felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. "Are you serious?" he blurted. Barnes groaned beside him, but Marcus couldn't stay silent anymore. "You're not even going to check the footage? The guy who stole ran out the door. I was still inside the store." Calloway finally looked at him. A long, slow stare. "Mr. Carter, I suggest you remain silent unless spoken to." His voice was calm, level, but there was an edge to it, a warning. Marcus swallowed hard, his pulse racing. Barnes cleared his throat, adjusting his tie like he was gearing up for something monumental. "Your Honor, I ask that we postpone this hearing until we can review the footage." Calloway barely let him finish. "Denied." Barnes sighed but continued on autopilot. "Your Honor, my client is a minor. He has no prior record. We request that he be released under parental supervision while we build a defense." Calloway leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes scanning the mostly empty courtroom. "I don't see a parent present," he said flatly. Marcus's stomach dropped. "Mom doesn't even know I'm here." "That tells me everything I need to know," Calloway continued. Marcus felt his hands shake, anger and panic mixing in his chest. This judge wasn't looking for the truth. He had already decided Marcus was guilty. "I've seen cases like this before," Calloway went on, his fingers tapping the desk. "These offenses are not taken lightly in my courtroom." Marcus gritted his teeth. What offenses? They had no evidence. The prosecutor shuffled his papers and spoke again. "Given the defendant's age and the nature of the offense, the prosecution requests that he be tried as an adult." The room tilted. "What?" Marcus said before he could stop himself. Barnes straightened in his chair. "Your Honor, my client is 16 years old. Trying him as an adult would." "Motion granted," Calloway cut in, his gavel slamming down. a felony charge, a criminal record that wouldn't disappear at 18. Marcus felt his world caving in. "Your Honor," Barnes tried one last time, voice shaking now. "At the very least, I ask that we reconsider bail." Calloway didn't even blink. "Bail is set at $10,000. Bang, the gavel came down again. "Next case." Marcus sat frozen. $10,000. His mom was well off, but she wasn't going to magically appear out of nowhere. And she didn't even know where he was. A guard grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the exit. His lawyer sighed, already flipping to his next case file. "Wait," Barnes murmured. Marcus turned toward him. "Do you have anyone you need to call?" Marcus's chest tightened. "Yes, someone who could burn this whole courtroom to the ground." He took a slow breath and spoke the words that changed everything. "I want to call my mother." A pause. "She's the U.S. Attorney General Vanessa Carter." And just like that, the room stopped breathing. The air in the courtroom shifted in an instant. It was as though the weight of the words Marcus had just spoken, the simple declaration that his mother was Vanessa Carter, the U.S. Attorney General, had sent a shockwave through the room. For a long, suffocating moment, no one said a word. Marcus stood there, his heart pounding, his breath coming faster as he absorbed the sudden shift in energy. The courtroom was no longer just a place where his life was being judged. It was suddenly a battleground. But it wasn't just about Marcus anymore. Now it was about power, and he had just brought the big guns into the arena. Judge Richard Calloway, who had been so quick to pass judgment, now clenched his fists under the desk. His face, which had been composed and cold just moments ago, had now lost its mask of indifference. His eyes flicked toward Marcus, then to prosecutor Kevin Doyle, and then back again, the realization hitting him hard. He had just made a massive mistake. This wasn't just any teenager sitting in front of him. This was Vanessa Carter's son. The U.S. Attorney General, someone with enough clout to tear down everything Calloway had ever stood for if she chose to. Doyle, the young prosecutor, stood frozen in place, his mouth slightly agape as he processed the bombshell Marcus had just dropped. His eyes flickered between Marcus, Calloway, and Monroe, the officer who had arrested Marcus. "Wait, what?" Doyle stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked like he'd just been told his entire career had just ended in a single sentence. Monroe, standing off to the side, had been staring at Marcus with cold detachment, his eyes now wide, his earlier confidence evaporating. He glanced nervously at the door, the tension in the room thickening. For the first time, it seemed like he was questioning whether he had made the right choice in arresting Marcus. He had no idea that he had just arrested the son of one of the most powerful women in the country. As silence stretched on, it became apparent that this was no longer a simple trial. This was now about more than just Marcus's fate. The system had just met someone who could bring it all crashing down, and that person was on her way. The whispers began almost immediately. The court clerk, who had been busy organizing paperwork at her desk, stood up and began making frantic phone calls. The judge's assistant was quickly dispatched to call the courthouse security, and Doyle's assistant was already texting someone on his phone, likely trying to track down the U.S. Attorney General, or at least verify Marcus's claim. But the real chaos was happening behind closed doors, away from the eyes of the public. In less than 20 minutes, the courtroom that had been filled with tension and anticipation suddenly felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Every official in the building seemed to be scrambling, making calls, trying to confirm whether Marcus's mother really was who he claimed her to be. One by one, the whispers reached the right ears. The courthouse suddenly felt like it was being hit by a wave of realization. Vanessa Carter wasn't just a name. She was a force. She had the resources to burn this system to the ground if she chose to. She was a walking symbol of justice, someone whose presence could tip the scales of power in an instant. and she was coming here. The doors to the courtroom swung open, cutting through the suffocating silence. There she stood, Vanessa Carter, dressed in a sharp navy blue power suit, her heels clicking decisively against the polished floor. Her expression was ice cold, her movements deliberate, each one exuding authority. She didn't need to raise her voice or make any grand gestures. She didn't need to threaten anyone, because everyone in this room knew exactly who she was, and that was enough. Her eyes locked with Judge Calloway, whose previously confident posture now looked shaky. For the first time, Calloway flinched. It wasn't that she was angry, it was that she was so completely in control of the situation. "Where is my son?" Vanessa's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a command that forced every head in the room to turn. She wasn't here to argue. She wasn't here to shout. She was here to take control. Calloway stood slowly, the weight of his position crumbling beneath her gaze. He shifted uncomfortably behind the bench, but his authority seemed so insignificant in the face of the woman standing before him. She didn't wait for him to respond. Her gaze never left him. "I want to know why my son was arrested without a shred of evidence." The words came out calmly, but they cut through the courtroom like a knife. It wasn't a demand. It was an unavoidable truth. And in that moment, everyone present realized this was no longer a case of theft. This was about something much bigger. The prosecutor, Kevin Doyle, suddenly seemed small, like he was trying to shrink into his chair, hoping to avoid Vanessa's gaze. His earlier confidence, the self-assurance that came from knowing he had the law on his side, was gone. All that was left was fear. "Your Honor, I," Doyle stuttered, looking for words that would save him, but his voice faltered. The entire room had been turned upside down. This wasn't just about a minor theft anymore. This was a full-blown power struggle. Vanessa didn't need to raise her voice, and she didn't need to say anything else. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone was waiting, unsure of what would happen next. Would Calloway fold? Would he stand his ground? But Vanessa Carter wasn't here to wait. She had made her point. Her gaze didn't waver from Calloway, and the air felt like it had frozen over. In the midst of all the chaos and confusion, one thing was certain: Vanessa Carter wasn't afraid of them. She didn't need to yell or use her status to intimidate anyone. She just had to be there. Her presence alone was enough to make everything fall into line. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She simply waited. The court clerk, who had been fumbling with her phone, finally looked up and scurried out of the room to fetch the release papers. The bailiff, who had been previously ignoring Marcus, now stood straighter, his face pale with the realization that everything he thought he knew was now up for questioning. Behind the scenes, the courthouse was unraveling. Judges, prosecutors, and officers who had believed they could brush this off now found themselves at the mercy of a force far greater than their small, local power. Vanessa Carter was a tidal wave, sweeping through their arrogance and revealing their ignorance. In just a few moments, Judge Calloway had gone from an unflinching authority figure to a man in survival mode, his hands trembling on the bench. His gavel was no longer a symbol of finality. It had become a fragile object, something he could no longer rely on to keep control. The courtroom wasn't just shifting power, it was resetting entirely. And in that reset, Marcus Carter, the innocent teenager caught in the web of injustice, was no longer just another case. He was now the symbol of something much greater, the fight for fairness in a broken system. The courtroom was still. A heavy, suffocating silence hung in the air, as if time had stopped entirely the moment Vanessa Carter spoke. The clerk, still holding her phone, remained frozen in place. Judge Calloway, once a figure of authority, a man who had ruled over the lives of countless individuals without a second thought, was now visibly rattled, his hands clenching the edge of his desk in a vain attempt to maintain control. He wasn't used to being questioned like this. He wasn't used to being challenged by someone who had the power to unravel everything he'd built. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, struggling to find words. I've seen cases like this before, he stammered, his voice wavering. The arresting officer acted in good faith. There was a description. But even as he spoke, his eyes kept flicking toward Vanessa, whose unwavering gaze was like a physical force pressing down on him. It was clear. He knew he was on the verge of being completely exposed. The description, Vanessa's voice rang out, sharp and cold. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She simply cut through his excuses like a razor. That description was about a man in a black hoodie, running out of the store. Your officer didn't even check the surveillance footage before making an arrest. And now, you're going to sit here and pretend that my son was guilty because he happened to be near the scene. Calloway's face went white. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the words wouldn't come. He was drowning in the realization that his entire career had been based on a system of biased rulings and unquestioned authority. Prosecutor Kevin Doyle was now shifting in his seat, the sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes darting around the room like he was looking for a way to escape. But there was no way out. Your Honor, we never had the chance to review the footage, Doyle admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. There was confusion at the scene. The officer just acted on what he thought was right. Marcus, still standing there, handcuffed to the chair, tried to hold back a bitter laugh. Confusion, confusion. This wasn't about confusion. This was about an officer who saw a black teenager and decided he was guilty without a second thought. But the truth was finally spilling out, and it was clear that Doyle had been just as complicit as Monroe in building this false narrative. The system they relied on was collapsing in on itself, and they couldn't hide from the damage they had caused anymore. Marcus watched as Detective Monroe stood up from his seat, his shoulders slumped, a look of disbelief still on his face. He fit the description, Monroe mumbled, but his voice lacked conviction. It wasn't the same assertive tone from the night before. The lie was exposed, and his words didn't even have the power they once did. You're telling me you arrested a kid based on what? His skin color? Vanessa's voice was calm, but there was a quiet rage beneath it. She didn't need to shout. Every word was a direct hit. Monroe's eyes flicked nervously to the ground. He looked like a man who had been caught, and he knew there was no escape. He had made a mistake, and there was no one left to cover it up. Vanessa's presence was a force. It was like a storm had entered the room, sweeping away the dust of old lies that had been allowed to accumulate for too long. As she turned her attention back to Judge Calloway, her voice didn't soften. "And what about you, Judge Calloway?" She took a step forward, her heels clicking sharply on the floor, each step measuring and deliberate. "You've been handing down harsh sentences to black teenagers for years, haven't you? I've seen your history, your rulings. You think people don't notice when you choose to be harsh on certain kids and lenient on others." Calloway's face went ashen, his mouth opening and closing in an attempt to defend himself, but there was nothing he could say. The truth was out there, and he knew it. He began to speak, but his voice cracked. "I followed the law." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "The law?" She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "No, Judge, what you followed was your own bias, and now you'll answer for it." Within an hour of Vanessa's arrival, Marcus Carter was released. The bailiff, who had once looked at him with disdain, was now rushing to complete the release papers, his hands shaking as he filed the paperwork with haste. The same officers who had treated Marcus like a criminal were now avoiding eye contact, stepping out of the way as though they couldn't be near him. The Silver Lake justice system, once so certain it could operate without consequence, was now scrambling to cover up its mistakes. Within moments, Marcus was free. As the police officers opened the door to let him go, the overwhelming sense of relief washed over him. But as soon as he stepped outside into the cold evening air, the weight of everything hit him like a tidal wave. He was free, yes. But at what cost? Marcus walked toward the courthouse steps, the cool breeze ruffling his clothes, but he didn't feel the freedom he thought he would. Yes, he was lucky. He had Vanessa Carter, his mother, to fight for him. He had someone who could challenge the system and make them listen. But how many other kids didn't have someone like her? How many black teenagers were swept away by this same broken system, never given the chance to prove their innocence because of their skin color? Marcus's stomach churned. He was lucky. But how many others wouldn't be? A few weeks later, Judge Calloway was investigated. His biased rulings over the years were finally under the microscope. Many of his past decisions were overturned, the cases re-examined. Detective Monroe was suspended from his position, and Prosecutor Doyle found himself under intense scrutiny for his role in the unjust prosecution of Marcus. But Marcus knew that justice shouldn't be a matter of luck. It shouldn't depend on who your mother was or how much power you had behind you. What about the next kid who doesn't have someone to fight for them? What about the kid who doesn't have a mother who can change the system with a single sentence? Marcus had been lucky. He had made it out. But the real fight wasn't about a single case. It wasn't about Marcus. It was about the system that relies on silence and complicity to keep the truth buried. And the only way to change it was if enough people refused to stay silent. As he walked out of the courthouse, his heart was heavy with the truth. This system won't change just because of one scandal. It only changes when enough people refuse to stay silent. The truth had been exposed, but the real challenge had just begun.